previous episode was an introduction to the colonial era of Sri Lanka. We learned about the entrance of the Portuguese into Sri Lanka. We also saw how history can be biased depending on the side of those that narrate it. We learned how being aware of the different perceptions and narratives of history can help us become real students of the past and learn from it. We explored a few reasons for colonialism and why the colonialists are portrayed as the evil side. We looked at what caused the colonialists to do what they did, the mindset prevalent at that time, and the cultural and historical context of that era. In this episode, we look at how the Muslims in Sri Lanka were affected by the landing of the first colonizing ships of the Portuguese in Sri Lanka and how they reacted to it. This is what a Portuguese governor had to say of the Moors. I quite understand the pain our arrival will give to the Moors, but as the sword which you see in my hand is one which I have often seen stained with their blood, I do not consider it a novelty to soak in Mohammedan blood the sword with which I vowed to die, since our conquests in general are more against them than against the heathen, who are excused by their ignorance, while the Moors are condemned by their malice. The central position of Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean, strategically placed as it is between the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, attracted the skilled Arabian navigators, traders, and explorers. On the evidence of the volumes titled The Temporal and Spiritual Conquest of Ceylon, which outline the Portuguese conquest of Ceylon in terms of territory and conversion, Father Quiros writes, "It is quite evident that in the commencement of the 16th century, the Muslims were in complete control of the import-export trade of the island, deriving much profit from it. No wonder they incurred the displeasure and incited the wrath of the Portuguese. The Indian Ocean trade was dominated not just by the Arabs, but a mixture of Arab, Indian, Malay, and Chinese merchants who together transported a spectrum of cargo, from spices to elephants. In the early 16th century, the new force in the form of Portuguese ships with mounted guns arrived in the ocean. These vessels, with their firepower and capacity for high speeds, overthrew the established Arab, Malay, Indian, and Chinese merchants and grabbed control of the ocean trade. The arrival of the Portuguese in Colombo in 1505 was ominous to the Muslims of Sri Lanka. Portuguese policy and attitude to them was an extension of their policy at home, and Colombo was to cease to be a Moorish city, and the Muslims became a persecuted lot. The Portuguese infiltrated the seas and the coasts of the Indian Ocean swiftly by bringing armed violence into the arenas of trade and commerce. The Portuguese seized control of the main routes in the east. They secured this by establishing power at three key points, namely Ormuz, Goa, and Malacca. These were to serve as their naval bases and commercial entrepôts. It was on the 15th of November in the year 1505 that a Portuguese fleet commanded by Lourenço de Almeida arrived in Colombo, and a settlement was thus established here. This fleet was actually on the way to Maldives and was blown into Colombo due to very harsh weathers. De Almeida was on a mission to destroy the Saracens, or Moors, as Muslims were referred to in 16th century Europe. At that time, the Moors were dominating international trade in South and Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. and the Moors had to be ousted if Portugal, the new power in Europe, was to prosper, which was also why they were specifically heading to the Maldives. At Galle, where the fleet touched the Sri Lankan shore, Lourenço de Almeida found it difficult to communicate with the local people. Therefore, after collecting some food, he sailed north along the western coast and landed in Colombo. To mark the event, he inscribed a quinas, or an emblem having shields, on a rock on the shore. This can be seen within the compound of the President's house in the fort. When the Portuguese first made their appearance, the coastline of Sri Lanka, in common with Gujarat, Malabar, Coromandel and Bengal, were thriving centers of Muslim maritime activity with sizable Muslim populations whose interests were strongly integrated with those of the local rulers. In Sri Lanka, there were substantial settlements at Putlam, Chilau, Madampe, Negombo, Colombo, Kalutara, Beruwala, Maggona, Payagala, Aluthgama, Bentota, Galle, Weligama and Mathara. At the port towns of Chilau, Negombo and Kalutara, the Moor communities were very influential, having their own headmen. At Negombo and Weligama, they had their own streets, while in Mathara their settlements were in the bazaar areas. In Colombo, the present-day New Moor Street and Old Moor Street indicate a strong concentration of Moors in those places for many centuries. When the Portuguese came to this island, the ancient Arab links with Sri Lanka, which had served Sri Lanka in rich and various ways, was completely severed. Even the Indo-Sri Lankan trade had to steal surreptitiously from creek to creek. Asian ships could sail the Asian seas provided a Portuguese license was obtained on payment and custom duties paid at certain specified ports. This unexpected arrival of the Portuguese dealt the death blow to the peaceful exchanges of commodities. The Arab ships were attacked as a matter of course and driven from their own waters. In the spheres of religion, politics, and commerce, the Portuguese and the Muslims were rivals, and the Muslims sensed that their period of unrivaled trade supremacy was over. They had heard of the atrocities committed by the Portuguese on their co-religionists in East Africa and India, and they realized what would follow. The lust for gold and love of God had driven the Portuguese to pursue a vigorous attempt at eliminating the Muslims from the eastern seas. When Lourenço de Almeida appeared in Colombo, there were a number of Muslim ships anchored in the harbor loading and unloading cargo. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the Muslims acted quickly and instigated the citizens of Colombo to take action against the intruder. The harbor was crowded with shipping. Some of the vessels were taking on board the elephants and the cinnamon for which the island had always been famous throughout the East and which were destined for Cambaya. Others were receiving the copra, which is the dried coconut kernels, and the fresh nuts of the coconut tree. The forests supplied the timber, which was being hauled to the shore for transport to the greater mart of Ormuz, while vessels from the south were landing their goods for transshipment to the Red Sea. The carrying trade was in the hands of a colony of Moors. Sadly, this could no longer continue. With the arrival of the Portuguese, the Muslims were forced to take a back seat. Though no longer dominant, the commercial skillfulness of the Muslims enabled them to continue operations in smaller trading activities. Many of them were forced to play a subordinate role by submitting to the new European power, while others chose to defy it and suffer the consequences.